The contract was already signed. The ink hadn't even dried when Lillian Carter realized she'd just married a complete stranger. Her hand trembled as she stared at the marriage certificate, the weight of what she'd done crushing down on her chest. Daniel Mercer stood beside her, silent, unreadable. A man who'd appeared out of nowhere with an impossible offer. Marry him, and he'd save everything her family was about to lose. No love, no promises, just a business arrangement that felt like selling her soul to keep the ranch from being auctioned off piece by piece. But desperation doesn't ask questions, and Lillian Carter had run out of choices 3 months ago. If you want to know how a marriage built on secrets can survive the truth, stay with me until the end. Hit that like button and drop a comment telling me what city you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories travel. The morning had started like any other nightmare. Lillian stood in the kitchen of the ranch house, her father's medical bills spread across the scarred wooden table like accusations. Each one screamed numbers she couldn't pay, dates she'd already missed, final notices printed in angry red ink. The bank letter sat on top, crisp, formal, and devastating in its simplicity. Foreclosure proceedings to begin in 30 days. 30 days to lose everything her family had built over 3 generations. Lily? Her father's voice drifted weakly from the bedroom down the hall. That you moving around out there? She quickly gathered the papers into a pile, shoving them into a drawer before he could see. Just making coffee, Dad. You need anything? I'm fine, don't fuss. But he wasn't fine. Thomas Carter had been declining steadily since the stroke 6 months ago, and the medical expenses had buried them deeper than any drought or bad cattle season ever could. The ranch hands had been let go one by one until only Lillian remained, working dawn to midnight trying to hold together what was rapidly falling apart. She poured herself coffee with hands that wanted to shake but didn't have the luxury. The kitchen window framed the view she'd known her entire life. Rolling Montana grassland stretching toward mountains that looked purple in the early light. The old barn her grandfather had built standing weathered but proud. The fence lines that marked the boundaries of Carter land. Land that wouldn't be theirs much longer. The knock at the front door came precisely at 8 o'clock. Lillian's stomach clenched. She knew who it would be. Marcus Webb from First National Bank, arriving right on schedule to remind her of facts she already knew by heart. She'd called him yesterday in a last desperate attempt to negotiate more time, and he'd agreed to stop by with options to discuss. She already knew what those options would be. Sell now and walk away with something, or wait for foreclosure and lose everything. She set down her coffee and walked to the door, pulling it open with more confidence than she felt. But it wasn't Marcus Webb standing on her porch. The man was tall, broad-shouldered, somewhere in his mid-30s with dark hair and the kind of weathered tan that came from years of outdoor work. He wore clean jeans, work boots, and a button-down shirt that looked recently pressed. His eyes were steady, dark brown, and completely unreadable. "Miss Carter?" His voice was deep, quiet, the kind that didn't need to be raised to be heard. "Yes?" Lillian kept one hand on the doorframe, suddenly very aware that she was alone in the house except for her bedridden father. "My name is Daniel Mercer. I understand you're having some trouble with the bank." The directness of it caught her off guard. Who told you that?" "Small town. Word travels." He didn't smile, didn't try to charm her, just stood there with a patience that suggested he'd wait as long as necessary for her to decide whether to slam the door in his face or listen. Lillian studied him, trying to place the name. Mercer. It sounded vaguely familiar, but she couldn't attach it to any family she knew. "What do you want, Mr. Mercer?" "To help. May I come in?" Every instinct told her to refuse. You didn't invite strange men into your home when you were vulnerable and desperate. But something in his demeanor, the calm steadiness, the lack of aggressive salesmanship, made her hesitate. "My father's resting," she said finally. "We can talk on the porch." Daniel nodded and stepped back, allowing her to join him outside. She pulled the door mostly closed behind her and crossed her arms, waiting. He got straight to the point. "I know the bank is foreclosing. I know your father's medical expenses have drained your savings. I know you've got about 30 days before you lose everything." Lillian's jaw tightened. "You seem to know a lot about my private business." "Like I said, small town." He met her eyes without flinching. I have a proposal that might solve your problems. Let me guess. You want to buy the ranch at a fraction of what it's worth, and I should be grateful for whatever scraps you offer. No. Daniel's expression didn't change. I'm proposing marriage. The words hung in the air between them, so unexpected that Lillian actually laughed, a short, sharp sound with no humor in it. Excuse me? You need money to save the ranch and care for your father. I can provide both. His tone was matter-of-fact, like he was discussing a livestock purchase. In exchange, I'd like legal partnership in the ranch and a legitimate marriage on paper. Lillian stared at him, trying to process whether this stranger was insane or if she was still asleep and having the world's strangest nightmare. You can't be serious. I'm completely serious. You just show up at my door and propose marriage to someone you've never met? I didn't say I'd never met you. Something flickered across his face too quickly to read. But that's not relevant. What matters is whether my proposal can help your situation. This is insane. Lillian turned away from him, gripping the porch railing. I don't even know you. You could be anyone. A con artist, a criminal. I'm neither. I own the Mercer property about 20 miles east of here. Been running cattle there for the past 8 years. You can verify everything I'm telling you. Even if that's true, why would you possibly want to marry a complete stranger? Daniel was quiet for a moment. When he spoke, his voice was careful, measured. I need a wife. You need financial security. It's a practical arrangement that benefits both of us. People don't just marry for practicality anymore, Mr. Mercer. This isn't the 1800s. People marry for worse reasons than honesty. He stepped closer, not crowding her, but close enough that she could see the absolute sincerity in his eyes. I'm not offering you romance or love, Miss Carter. I'm offering you a solution. I'll pay off your debts, cover your father's medical care, and help you keep this ranch running. In return, I get a legal partnership and a wife. On paper, at least. On paper? Lillian repeated slowly. You mean? I mean this would be a business arrangement. I'm not asking for anything you're not comfortable giving. Separate rooms, separate lives, if that's what you want. But legally married so there are no questions about the legitimacy of the arrangement. Lillian's mind was racing, trying to find the trap in what he was offering. It was too perfect, too convenient. Men didn't just appear out of nowhere offering to solve all your problems with no strings attached. What's the catch? No catch, just honesty on both sides. I keep my promises and I expect the same in return. Why me? The question came out sharper than she intended. If you need a wife for some mysterious reason, there are plenty of women who jump at the chance to marry a ranch owner. Why show up here with this bizarre proposal? Daniel held her gaze for a long moment. Because you need help, and I'm in a position to provide it. Sometimes things are that simple. Nothing is ever that simple. Then consider it a gamble. You gamble that I'm telling the truth and get to keep your ranch. I gamble that you'll honor the agreement and give me what I'm asking for. Which is what exactly? You still haven't told me why you need a wife. Does it matter? You be getting what you need. Lillian wanted to scream at the infuriating calmness of him. He was offering her everything she desperately needed while refusing to explain why, and somehow expecting her to just accept it all on faith. I need time to think about this. You have until the bank takes your property. After that, there won't be anything to save. Daniel reached into his pocket and pulled out a business card. My number. Call me when you decide. He turned to leave, and Lillian found herself calling after him. Wait, how do I know you actually have the money you're claiming? That you can pay off the debts? Daniel pulled a folded paper from his jacket and handed it to her. Bank statement. You can verify it's legitimate. Lillian unfolded the paper with trembling fingers. The numbers swam in front of her eyes, more than enough to cover everything they owed, with plenty to spare. This could be fake. Call the bank and verify. The account number's right there. I will. Good. You should verify everything before you make a decision this important. He paused at the porch steps. One more thing, Miss Carter. Whatever you decide, I'll respect it. But if you say yes, I need your word that you'll honor the commitment. I don't do things halfway, and I won't be married to someone who does. Then he was gone, walking to a dusty pickup truck parked in the drive and pulling away without looking back. Lillian stood on the porch clutching his business card and bank statement, her heart pounding so hard she could hear it in her ears. The whole encounter had taken maybe 10 minutes, and in that time, a complete stranger had walked into her life and offered to solve every problem that had been drowning her for months. It was insane. It was impossible. It was exactly what she needed. She spent the rest of the day investigating Daniel Mercer with the thoroughness of a detective. The bank confirmed his account was real and the funds were legitimate. The county records showed he owned a substantial property deed-free, no liens or suspicious activity. The few people in town who knew him described him as quiet, hardworking, kept to himself, but paid his bills on time, and treated people fairly. Nobody knew much about his personal life. Nobody knew where he'd come from before buying the Mercer Ranch 8 years ago. Nobody could explain why a successful rancher in his mid-30s was still unmarried, but nobody had a bad word to say about him either. "Lily?" Her father's voice called from the bedroom. "You gonna tell me who that was stopped by this morning?" She walked into his room, finding Thomas Carter propped up against pillows, looking thinner and frailer than she wanted to acknowledge. His right side was still partially paralyzed from the stroke, and the tremor in his left hand had gotten worse. "Just someone asking about buying cattle," she lied smoothly. No point worrying him until she'd made a decision. "We got cattle to sell?" His words were slightly slurred, another effect of the stroke. "Maybe. We'll see." She adjusted his pillows, avoiding his too knowing gaze. Her father had always been able to read her better than anyone. "Lily, I know things are bad. The medical bills are being handled. Don't worry about it. This is my ranch, my responsibility." "It's our ranch, Dad, and I'm handling it." She kissed his forehead. "You just focus on getting better." But they both knew he wasn't going to get better. The doctors had been clear about that. The best they could hope for was maintaining his current condition, and even that required expensive medications and regular therapy they could barely afford. That night, Lillian sat in the ranch office, really just a converted bedroom with a desk and filing cabinets, and spread out all the financial documents again. She did the math for the 100th time, hoping somehow the numbers would magically change. They didn't. Even if she sold every head of cattle, every piece of equipment, it wouldn't be enough to cover the debts and keep the land. The bank was going to take the ranch. Her father would have to go into a state facility because she couldn't afford to care for him. 3 generations of Carter history would be auctioned off to pay creditors, unless she married Daniel Mercer. The thought made her feel sick and relieved in equal measure. Sick because she'd always imagined getting married for love, not as a business transaction. Relieved because for the first time in months, there was actually a way out of this nightmare. She picked up Daniel's business card and stared at it until the numbers blurred. What did she really know about him? Nothing except what could be verified on paper. He could be anyone underneath that calm exterior. He could have motives she couldn't begin to guess. He could be dangerous. But the bank was definitely dangerous. Foreclosure was definitely coming. Losing everything was a certainty. At least with Daniel Mercer, there was a chance. Lillian reached for the phone before she could change her mind. He answered on the second ring. "Mercer." "It's Lillian Carter." A pause. "Have you made a decision?" "I have questions first." "All right. If I agree to this, what exactly would you expect from me?" "Partnership in running the ranch, legal marriage, honesty." His voice was steady, giving nothing away. "Beyond that, we'd figure out the details as we go." "You said separate rooms, separate lives. Do you mean that?" "Yes, unless you decided otherwise." The way he said it, so carefully neutral, made her wonder what he actually wanted, but she pushed the thought aside. "And my father? He'd be cared for? Properly?" "Whatever medical care he needs, for as long as he needs it. That's not negotiable." "Why not? You're getting the ranch partnership out of this. Why agree to care for a sick old man you don't even know?" "Because he's part of the deal, and I honor my deals." Daniel's tone didn't change. "Anything else you need to know?" Lillian took a deep breath. This was insane. She was actually considering marrying a stranger because he'd shown up with a bank statement and a business proposal. If she told anyone, they'd think she'd lost her mind. But nobody else had shown up offering to help. Nobody else had cared enough to try. "If I say yes," she said slowly, "how would this work?" "We'd get married as soon as possible. This week, if you're willing. I'd transfer funds to cover your immediate debts, then we'd sit down and figure out a long-term plan for managing the ranch together." "This week?" Her voice cracked slightly. That's really fast. You don't have time to waste. The bank won't wait, and neither will your father's medical needs." He paused. "But if you need more time to decide, take it. I won't pressure you, Miss Carter. This has to be your choice." That was the thing that kept surprising her, the absolute lack of pressure from him. He'd stated his offer, answered her questions, and left the decision entirely in her hands. For some reason, that made her trust him more than any amount of charm or persuasion would have. "I need to think about it." "Take the time you need. The offer stands." Lillian hung up and sat in the dark office, listening to the old house settle around her. Somewhere down the hall, her father was sleeping, unaware that his daughter was considering marrying a stranger to save everything he'd built. The weight of it pressed down on her until she could barely breathe. But beneath the fear and uncertainty, there was something else, a tiny spark of hope she hadn't felt in months. The possibility that maybe, just maybe, there was a way through this, after all. 3 days later, Lillian called Daniel back. "I'll do it," she said without preamble. "I'll marry you." There was a beat of silence on the other end. "You're certain?" "No. But I'm out of options, and you're offering me a way to save my father and our home. So yes, I'll do it." "When?" She closed her eyes. "As soon as you can arrange it." "Friday, county clerk's office, 10 o'clock. Is that acceptable?" "Friday, 3 days away. 3 days until she became Mrs. Daniel Mercer, married to a man she'd spoken to exactly 3 times. Yes, that's acceptable. I'll pick you up at 9:30. We'll need 2 witnesses." "I can't tell my father. Not yet. He'd never understand." "Then we'll tell him after." "Whatever you think is best." Daniel's voice gentled slightly. "Miss Carter, Lillian, I know this isn't what you wanted, but I promise you won't regret giving me a chance to help." "Don't make promises you can't keep, Mr. Mercer." "I never do, Tout." Friday morning arrived with brutal sunshine and a sky so blue it hurt to look at. Lillian dressed in the only good dress she owned, a simple navy blue she'd worn to her mother's funeral 3 years ago. She told her father she was going into town to meet with the bank, which was technically true even if she left out the part about getting married first. Daniel arrived exactly at 9:30, driving the same pickup truck he'd arrived in that first day. He wore dark slacks and a white dress shirt, his hair neatly combed, looking like a man heading to a business meeting rather than his own wedding. The drive to town was silent. Lillian stared out the window, her hands clenched in her lap, trying not to think about what she was about to do. "You can still change your mind," Daniel said quietly as they pulled into the parking lot. "No judgment if you do." Lillian looked at him, really looked at him, for the first time since he'd picked her up. His expression was calm, but there was something in his eyes she couldn't quite read. Concern, maybe, or understanding. "Can you still transfer the money to pay off the debts if I don't marry you?" "No, the marriage is part of the agreement." "Then I'm not changing my mind." She reached for the door handle. "Let's get this over with." The ceremony took less than 15 minutes. The county clerk served as one witness, her assistant as the other. They stood in a small, sterile office that smelled like old paper and floor cleaner, while a bored-looking justice of the peace read through the standard vows. "Do you, Daniel James Mercer, take this woman to be your lawfully wedded wife?" "I do." His voice was steady, certain. "Do you, Lillian Marie Carter, take this man to be your lawfully wedded husband?" Lillian's throat was so tight she could barely force the words out. "I do. By the power vested in me by the state of Montana, I now pronounce you husband and wife. You may kiss the bride." Daniel looked at her, one eyebrow slightly raised in question. Lillian shook her head minutely, and he simply nodded to the justice of the peace instead. "Thank you." They signed the marriage certificate, Daniel's handwriting bold and clear, Lillian's shaking slightly. The clerk made a copy for their records, handed them the original, and just like that, it was done. Lillian Carter was now Lillian Mercer, married to a man who felt like a complete stranger. They walked back to the truck in silence. Daniel opened her door, waited until she was settled, then walked around to the driver's side. But he didn't start the engine immediately. "I'll transfer the money this afternoon," he said, staring straight ahead through the windshield. "By Monday, all your debts will be cleared." "Thank you." The words felt inadequate for what he was doing. "I'll move my things to the ranch over the weekend. We can discuss sleeping arrangements and how you want to handle things with your father." "Separate rooms," Lillian said quickly. "Like we agreed." "Separate rooms," Daniel confirmed. "I'll take one of the smaller bedrooms upstairs. You can stay in the master where you are now." She nodded, relieved he wasn't going to make this harder than it had to be. Daniel finally turned to look at her, and for the first time since they'd met, something unguarded showed in his expression. "I know this isn't a real wedding to you. I know you're doing this out of necessity, not choice. But I want you to know, I take this seriously. The vows we just made, the commitment we entered into. I'll honor it, Lillian. All of it." The intensity in his voice caught her off guard. "I'll honor it too," she said softly. "I don't break my promises either." "Good." He started the engine. "Then we understand each other." The drive back to the ranch seemed shorter than the drive into town. When they pulled up to the house, Lillian saw the curtain move in her father's bedroom window and knew he'd seen them arrive together. "Do you want me to come in?" Daniel asked. "Help explain?" "No, I need to do this myself." She clutched the marriage certificate like a shield. "When will you be back?" "Tomorrow morning. I'll bring what I need to move in, and we can start figuring out how to run this place together." Lillian nodded and climbed out of the truck. She was halfway to the porch when Daniel called her name. "Lillian." She turned back. "Welcome to the family, Mrs. Mercer." There was something almost gentle in the way he said it, though his expression remained neutral. She didn't know what to say to that, so she just nodded and walked inside. Her father was sitting up in bed, eyes sharp despite his physical weakness. "That was a long meeting with the bank." Lillian sat down in the chair beside his bed and took a deep breath. "Dad, I need to tell you something, and I need you to listen before you react." His eyes narrowed. "What did you do?" "I got married this morning." The silence that followed was deafening. Thomas Carter stared at his daughter like she'd just announced she was joining the circus. "You what?" "I married Daniel Mercer. He owns the ranch east of here. He's agreed to help us." "Help us how?" Her father's voice was dangerously quiet. "He's paying off all our debts. The bank, the medical bills, everything. In exchange, I married him, and he's getting partnership in the ranch." "Lillian Marie Carter. Mercer," she corrected softly. "My name is Mercer, now." Her father's face flushed with anger and something that might have been shame. "I didn't raise you to sell yourself to save my pride. You raised me to fight for what matters. This ranch matters. You matter. And I did what I had to do to save both." Lillian leaned forward, taking his good hand. "Dad, we were going to lose everything. The bank was foreclosing. You were going to end up in some state facility where I could barely afford to visit. This way, we keep the ranch, you get proper care, and we have a chance to actually survive instead of just slowly drowning." "By marrying a stranger, Lily, you don't know anything about this man." "I know enough. I know he's honest, he keeps his word, and he's offering us a way out when nobody else gave a damn that we were going under." Her voice cracked. "I know you hate this. I hate it too. But sometimes we don't get the choices we want. We only get the choices we can live with." Thomas Carter looked at his daughter, really looked at her, and seemed to see for the first time how much the past 6 months had aged her. The shadows under her eyes, the thinness of her face, the weight of responsibility she'd been carrying alone. "What did you agree to?" he asked finally. "What does he expect from you?" "Partnership in the ranch. Legal marriage, that's all. We have separate rooms, separate lives. It's a business arrangement, Dad, nothing more." "Marriage is supposed to be more than business, Lily." "Maybe in a perfect world, but this is the world we're living in." She squeezed his hand gently. "He's moving in tomorrow. I need you to give him a chance. For me." Her father was quiet for a long time, his jaw working as he processed everything she'd told him. Finally, he nodded. If you trust him, I'll try. But if he hurts you, paralyzed or not, I'll find a way to make him regret it. Lillian kissed his forehead. I love you, Dad. Love you too, little girl, even when you make decisions that scare the hell out of me. Tut. That night, Lillian lay in bed staring at the ceiling, wearing a gold wedding band Daniel had produced at the courthouse. Simple, unadorned, but perfectly sized like he'd somehow known exactly what she needed. The weight of it on her finger felt strange and foreign, a constant reminder of what she'd done. She was married to Daniel Mercer, a man she didn't know, didn't love, couldn't even claim to like since she barely knew him well enough to form an opinion, but a man who'd saved her when everyone else had turned away. The tears came then, silent and hot, sliding down her temples into her hair. She cried for the wedding she'd always imagined and would never have, for the romance she'd dreamed of as a girl, for the future she'd lost the moment she'd signed that marriage certificate. But she also cried with relief, because the suffocating weight of debt was gone. The terror of losing everything had lifted. Her father would be cared for properly. The ranch would survive. The price had been high, but at least there was still something left to save. Tomorrow Daniel would arrive with his belongings, and their strange new life would begin, whatever that looked like. Lillian fell asleep still wearing her wedding dress, too exhausted to change, and dreamed of dark, steady eyes and a voice that promised to keep every word he'd given. Daniel arrived at sunrise. Lillian heard his truck pull up while she was making coffee, her father still asleep down the hall. She watched through the kitchen window as Daniel unloaded 3 boxes and 2 duffel bags, apparently everything he owned that mattered enough to bring. She opened the door before he could knock. "Morning," he said simply. "Morning. You didn't bring much." "Don't need much." He gestured to the boxes. "Clothes, books, some personal items. I can bring furniture later if needed, but I figured we'd work that out together." The casual assumption of partnership, of we, still felt foreign, but Lillian stepped aside and let him in. "The bedroom at the end of the hall upstairs is empty," she said. "It's smaller than mine, but it has its own bathroom, and it'll be fine." Daniel set the boxes down. "Is your father awake? I'd like to meet him properly." "He's still sleeping. He usually wakes up around 8. Then I'll wait." Daniel looked around the kitchen with the assessing gaze of someone seeing possibilities, not just what was. "How about I make breakfast while you show me around the property? I should get a sense of what needs doing." It was such a normal suggestion, making breakfast, touring the ranch, that Lillian almost laughed at the absurdity of it. They were married strangers trying to figure out how to live under the same roof, and he was suggesting scrambled eggs and a walk around the fence line. "All right," she agreed. "Breakfast sounds good." They moved through the kitchen in careful choreography, Daniel asking where things were kept, Lillian pointing out the coffee mugs and the pan that didn't stick. It felt domestic in a way that made her deeply uncomfortable, like they were play acting at being a normal married couple. But the scrambled eggs he made were perfect, and the coffee was strong, and when they sat down at the table together, the silence wasn't as awkward as she'd feared. "Your father," Daniel said after a few minutes. "Tell me about his condition. What does he need?" So Lillian told him about the stroke, the paralysis, the medications that kept him stable but wouldn't make him better, about the physical therapy he needed but they couldn't afford, about the slow decline she'd been watching helplessly for months. Daniel listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. "I'll call my doctor on Monday, get a specialist to come out and evaluate him properly. There might be treatments or therapies that could help more than what he's getting now." "That's expensive." "We're not worrying about expensive anymore." He met her eyes steadily. "That's the whole point of this arrangement, Lillian. You don't have to carry this alone anymore." The kindness in his voice made her throat tight. She looked away, focusing on her coffee. "Thank you." After breakfast, they walked the property together. Daniel asked questions about the irrigation system, the condition of the pastures, the equipment in the barn. He didn't criticize what he saw, the things that were broken or neglected because she'd been too overwhelmed to fix them, just made mental notes and occasionally jotted something in a small notebook he pulled from his pocket. "The north fence needs replacing," he observed, "and that water tank has a leak. I know, I just haven't had time. I'll handle it." He glanced at her. "That's why I'm here, remember? Partnership means I take on half the work." You're taking on way more than half. Daniel shrugged. For now, maybe, until we get things stabilized. Then we'll see. They were walking back toward the barn when Lillian finally asked the question that had been bothering her since he'd first appeared on her porch. Why did you really do this, Daniel? And don't tell me it's just because you needed a wife. There's more to it than that. He was quiet for so long she thought he wasn't going to answer. When he finally spoke, his voice was measured, careful. Sometimes people come into your life at exactly the moment you need help, and if you're in a position to provide that help, it seems wrong not to try. He met her eyes. You needed saving, Lillian. I could save you. That's reason enough. But what do you get out of it? Daniel's expression flickered with something she couldn't read. A wife, a partnership, a chance to build something that matters. He paused. Isn't that what everyone wants? It wasn't really an answer, but Lillian sensed pushing harder wouldn't get her anywhere. Daniel Mercer was a man who revealed things in his own time, in his own way. I'm going to check on my father, she said finally. He should be awake by now. I'll finish unloading my things, then I'd like to meet him, if that's all right. Lillian nodded and headed back to the house, leaving Daniel standing in the morning sunlight looking at the ranch like a man surveying a kingdom he'd just acquired, or perhaps like a man who'd finally come home. The introduction between Daniel and Thomas Carter happened in the sun-filled bedroom that had become the older man's world. Lillian stood by the window, arms crossed, watching two men who held her future between them size each other up like wary animals meeting on neutral ground. Mr. Carter, Daniel extended his hand, then seemed to realize Thomas couldn't easily shake with his paralyzed right side. Without missing a beat, he shifted and offered his left hand instead. Daniel Mercer, I'm sorry we're meeting under these circumstances. Thomas took the offered hand with his trembling left, studying Daniel with the sharp eyes of a man who'd spent 67 years reading people. My daughter tells me you married her to pay our debts. Dad, Lillian started, but Daniel held up a hand. That's partly true, Daniel said calmly. I married your daughter because she needed help and I was in a position to provide it, but I also married her because I wanted to. There's a difference. Is there? Thomas's voice was hard. Sounds like charity dressed up as marriage to me. Then you're not hearing me correctly. Daniel pulled up the chair beside the bed and sat down, meeting Thomas at eye level. I'm not doing you a favor, Mr. Carter. I'm entering a partnership with your daughter that benefits both of us. She gets financial security and help running this ranch. I get a wife and the chance to build something meaningful. That's not charity. That's a fair exchange. She deserves better than a business arrangement. Maybe. But she didn't have better options, and neither of us can change that. Daniel's voice was firm, but not unkind. What we can change is what happens from here. I've made promises to your daughter, and I keep my promises. I'll care for this ranch, I'll make sure you get proper medical treatment, and I'll treat Lillian with the respect she deserves, whether you approve or not. The two men stared at each other, and Lillian held her breath, waiting for her father to either explode or retreat into cold silence. Instead, Thomas laughed, a rusty sound that shook his thin frame. You got backbone, I'll give you that. Most men wouldn't have the balls to sit here and tell me they married my daughter for a business deal. Most men would lie about it. I don't see the point in lying. Daniel's expression remained neutral. We are where we are. The question is whether you're going to make this harder on Lillian by fighting it, or whether you're going to accept that she made the choice she thought was right. Thomas glanced at his daughter, saw the tension in her shoulders, the worry in her eyes. His expression softened. You really want this, Lily? This arrangement with him? I want to keep the ranch, Lillian said quietly. I want you to get proper care. I want to stop drowning. If this is what it takes, then yes, I want it. Then I guess I'm welcoming a son-in-law. Thomas looked back at Daniel. But hear me clear, Mercer. You hurt my daughter, and paralyzed or not, I'll find a way to make you pay for it. Fair enough. Daniel stood and extended his left hand again. I'll call my doctor on Monday about getting you evaluated. There might be treatments that could help more than what you're getting now. I don't need charity. It's not charity. You're family now. Family takes care of each other. He said it so simply, like it was just a fact of life rather than a revolutionary concept. After Daniel left the room to finish unpacking, Thomas caught Lillian's hand. He's an odd one. I know. But he seems honest. That counts for something. I think so too. Lillian squeezed her father's hand gently. We're going to be okay, Dad. I really think we're going to be okay. The first week of marriage passed in a strange blur of adjustment. Daniel moved through the house and ranch with quiet efficiency, fixing things that had been broken for months, organizing systems that had fallen into chaos. He rose before dawn, worked until dusk, and asked for nothing beyond basic courtesy and the occasional question about where things were kept or how Thomas preferred things done. He was unfailingly polite to Lillian, treating her with a formal respect that somehow felt more distant than anger would have. They shared meals in near silence, discussed ranch business with professional detachment, and retreated to separate rooms each night like strangers staying in the same hotel. It should have been exactly what Lillian wanted. The practical arrangement they'd agreed to, with no messy emotions to complicate things. Instead, it left her feeling oddly hollow. He's a ghost, she told her father one afternoon while helping him with his physical therapy exercises. He's here, he's helping, but it's like living with someone who's not quite real. Give it time, Thomas advised, wincing as she stretched his weakened arm. People don't open up overnight. Maybe he's just as uncomfortable with all this as you are. But Daniel didn't seem uncomfortable. He seemed perfectly content with their arrangement, never pushing for more, never expressing dissatisfaction with less. If anything, he seemed relieved by the boundaries between them. It was driving Lillian slowly crazy, though she couldn't explain why. 2 weeks after the wedding, she was working in the old barn, trying to patch a section of roof that leaked every time it rained. The ladder was rickety, the shingles were brittle, and she was pretty sure this whole project was a terrible idea, but they couldn't afford to hire someone, and Daniel was in town picking up supplies. She was hammering in a nail when the rotted board beneath her foot suddenly gave way. Lillian yelped, the hammer flying from her hand as she grabbed for the roof edge. Her fingers caught the gutter, the metal cutting into her palms as her feet scrambled for purchase on the ladder. For one terrifying moment, she was suspended between falling and holding on, her arms screaming with the strain. Then strong hands caught her waist, steadying her weight. I've got you. Daniel's voice was calm, controlled. Step down slowly. I'm right here. Lillian's heart was hammering so hard she could barely breathe, but she forced herself to move carefully, letting Daniel guide her down the ladder until her feet touched solid ground. Only then did she realize she was shaking. What the hell were you thinking? Daniel's hands were still on her waist, his face closer to hers than it had been since they'd married. That roof is half rotted. You could have broken your neck. I was trying to fix the leak. By killing yourself? His voice rose slightly, the first real emotion she'd heard from him in 2 weeks. Lillian, if something needs fixing, ask me. That's why I'm here. I've been fixing things myself for months. I didn't think, well, start thinking. He stepped back, running a hand through his hair in a gesture of frustration. You're not alone anymore. You don't have to do everything yourself. I don't know how not to. The words burst out of her, surprising them both. I've been the only one keeping this place running, the only one taking care of my father, the only one holding everything together. I don't know how to just stop and ask for help. Daniel stared at her for a long moment, something shifting in his expression. Then learn. Because I didn't marry you just to watch you work yourself to death trying to prove you don't need anyone. You married me for a business arrangement, remember? That doesn't mean I want to see you hurt. His voice softened. Come on, let me look at your hands. The gutter tore them up. She hadn't even noticed. But now that he mentioned it, her palms were bleeding, deep cuts from where she'd grabbed the sharp metal edge. Daniel led her to the water pump behind the barn, carefully cleaning the wounds while she stood there feeling oddly fragile. You need to be more careful, he said quietly, wrapping her hands in clean cloth from his pocket. Please. The please undid something in her chest. I'm sorry. I didn't mean to worry you. I know. He finished tying off the bandage and met her eyes. But you did anyway. That night, Lillian lay in bed thinking about the concern in Daniel's voice, the gentleness of his hands treating her cuts, the way he'd looked at her like she actually mattered to him as more than just a business partner. It confused her more than the distance had. The following afternoon, while Daniel was out checking the irrigation system in the north pasture, Lillian decided to clean out the barn properly. They'd need it organized if they were going to get through the winter, and the physical work would keep her from obsessing over her confusing feelings about her strange marriage. She started with the clutter that had accumulated over years: broken tools that needed mending, old tack that needed oiling, boxes of miscellaneous items her father had saved for reasons she couldn't fathom. The barn had always been his domain, and going through his things felt like intruding on private territory, even though he couldn't physically work here anymore. She was moving a stack of warped boards when she noticed the floorboard underneath was loose. Not just loose, deliberately removable, with finger holes carved into the wood. Curiosity got the better of her. Lillian pulled up the board and found herself staring into a shallow space beneath the barn floor. Inside was a tin box, old and rusted at the edges, the kind that had once held cookies or tea. She shouldn't open it. It was probably her father's, something private he'd hidden away. But her hands were already lifting the lid. Inside were letters, dozens of them, tied together with a faded ribbon. The paper was yellowed with age, the handwriting neat and careful. Lillian pulled out the top letter and unfolded it, her heart starting to race as she read the first lines. "I saw you by the creek today, laughing with your friends. The sunlight caught in your hair, and for a moment I forgot how to breathe. You probably didn't even notice me working on the fence line nearby. You never do, but I notice everything about you." Lillian's hands trembled. This wasn't her father's handwriting. These letters were written by someone else, someone who'd watched her years ago. She grabbed another letter at random. "You helped that injured bird today, spending an hour trying to splint its broken wing even though everyone said it wouldn't survive. It did survive, eventually. I think wounded things always try harder when you're the one caring for them. I know I would." Another letter. "Your father was teaching you to ride the new mare, and you fell 3 times but kept getting back up. You have this determination in you, this refusal to quit even when things are hard. I wonder if you know how remarkable that is. I wonder if anyone's ever told you." Lillian's breath caught. These letters were about her, written by someone who'd watched her, admired her, cared about her from a distance. The details were too specific, too personal to be anything but real observations. She rifled through more letters, her heart pounding harder with each one. They were all the same. Quiet observations, small moments, feelings expressed with an honesty that made her chest ache. Whoever had written these had been completely, utterly in love with her. But the letters were unsigned. Every single one ended with just an initial. D. Lillian sat back on her heels, the box of letters trembling in her hands. D. Daniel. No. That was impossible. Daniel had said he'd never met her before showing up on her porch with his proposal. He'd acted like a complete stranger. But what if he'd lied? She thought back to that first conversation, replaying his exact words. "I didn't say I'd never met you, but that's not relevant." She'd assumed he meant he'd seen her in passing, maybe at the feed store or around town. She'd never imagined he meant he'd known her well enough to write love letters. Lillian's mind raced, trying to piece together the timeline. The letters were old, yellowed with age. Some of them referenced her as a teenager. The details mentioned ranch work, fence repairs, daily tasks. The boy who wrote them worked on her family's ranch when they were teenagers. The voice of memory hit her like a physical blow. Her father had hired temporary help during the summers when she was 16 and 17. She remembered a few ranch hands coming and going, quiet young men who'd worked hard and kept to themselves. She tried to remember their names, their faces. But it had been so long ago, and she'd been a self-absorbed teenager more interested in her friends than the hired help working on her father's land. Had one of them been Daniel? She looked at the letters again, really studied them. The handwriting was the same as Daniel's. She recognized it from the grocery lists he'd started leaving on the kitchen counter, the notes he made in his ranch journal. The same neat, careful script, the same signature initial. Lillian's hands were shaking so badly she could barely retie the ribbon around the letters. She needed to think. She needed to process this without immediately confronting him, but the questions were already burning in her mind. If Daniel had known her years ago, if he'd cared about her enough to write these letters, why had he pretended to be a stranger? Why had he waited 15 years to come back? Why had he hidden the truth? And what else was he hiding? She carefully replaced the letters in the tin box and put it back in the hiding spot, covering it with the loose floorboard. Her mind was spinning, every interaction with Daniel suddenly taking on new meaning. The way he'd known exactly what size wedding ring she needed. The way he'd seemed to understand what she needed before she asked. The way he'd looked at her sometimes, like he was seeing someone he'd known forever rather than a woman he'd just met. It had all seemed like coincidence or lucky guesses. Now it felt like something else entirely. Lillian walked back to the house in a daze, her thoughts tangled. Part of her wanted to march up to Daniel the moment he returned and demand the truth. But another part of her, the part that had learned caution through months of desperation, urged her to wait, to observe, to figure out what game he was playing before she revealed her hand. That evening at dinner, she watched him carefully. Daniel ate with his usual quiet efficiency, asking about her father's physical therapy session, mentioning that the irrigation repairs had gone well. Nothing in his demeanor suggested guilt or secrets. But Lillian saw everything differently now, the way his eyes lingered on her face just a moment too long, the way he knew how she took her coffee without asking, the way he'd positioned himself in the household, helpful but unobtrusive, essential but invisible, like a man who'd been planning this for a very long time. "Something wrong?" Daniel asked, noticing her staring. Lillian forced herself to look away. "No, just tired." "You should rest. I can handle the evening chores." "I'm fine." But she wasn't fine. She spent the next 3 days in a state of heightened awareness, catching details she'd missed before. The way Daniel knew where her mother's favorite serving platter was kept, even though Lillian hadn't used it since the wedding. The way he'd fixed the porch railing exactly the way her father used to prefer it without being told. The way he navigated the property like someone who'd walked every inch of it before. Small things, individually meaningless. Together, damning. On the 4th day after finding the letters, Lillian couldn't stand it anymore. She waited until after dinner, after her father had gone to bed, and found Daniel in the barn tending to one of the horses. "We need to talk." He looked up from checking the horse's hooves, his expression calm. "All right." Lillian pulled the tin box from behind her back and held it up. "I found these, hidden under the barn floor." Daniel's face went completely still. Not surprised, not guilty, just still, like a man who'd been waiting for this moment and finally had it arrive. "I see," he said quietly. "Is that all you're going to say?" Her voice shook slightly. "I find love letters written about me 15 years ago, signed with your initial, and all you can say is, 'I see'?" Daniel carefully set down the horse's hoof and straightened, wiping his hands on his jeans. "What do you want me to say?" "The truth. Were you here before? Did you work on this ranch when I was a teenager?" "Yes." The simple admission knocked the breath from her lungs. "How long?" "2 summers, when you were 16 and 17. I was 19 the first summer, 20 the second." His voice was steady, matter-of-fact, like he was reciting facts from a ledger. "I needed work. Your father needed help. It was temporary." "And you wrote these?" She shook the tin box. "You watched me and wrote letters about me and never said a word?" "No, I never said a word. What would have been the point?" "You were the rancher's daughter, smart and beautiful and full of dreams about leaving for college. I was temporary help with nothing to offer." He met her eyes without flinching. "Some feelings are better left unspoken, Lillian." "But you came back." Her heart was pounding. 15 years later, you came back and pretended not to know me. You proposed marriage like we were strangers. Why?" "Because we were strangers. You didn't remember me then, and you don't remember me now." There was no accusation in his voice, just simple truth. "I was part of the background of your life, Lillian. Invisible. That didn't change just because I noticed you." "That's not an answer. Why did you come back? Why did you propose marriage? Why hide who you were?" Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful, controlled. "I left Montana after that second summer and built a life. Made money, bought land, created something worth having. But I never forgot about this place. Never forgot about you." He paused. "Last year, I heard through mutual acquaintances that your father had taken ill. that the ranch was in trouble. I kept tabs on the situation, and when I realized how bad things had gotten, I made a decision. To swoop in and rescue me? Bitterness crept into her voice. To play the hero and finally get the girl you'd been pining after? To help someone I cared about, even if she didn't know I existed. Daniel's voice hardened slightly. Don't twist this into something ugly, Lillian. I gave you a choice. You said yes. Everything I promised you has been true. The money, the help, the partnership. The only thing I kept from you was history that didn't matter anymore. Didn't matter? She laughed, the sound harsh. You married me under false pretenses. I married you honestly. I told you I needed a wife. I told you I wanted to help. I told you it would be a partnership. All of that was true. But you left out the part where you'd been in love with me for 15 years. Because that part is my burden to carry, not yours. He stepped closer, and for the first time since she'd known him, real emotion cracked through his controlled exterior. You want the whole truth, Lillian? Fine. Yes, I cared about you when we were young. Yes, I wrote those letters because putting feelings on paper was the only way to process them without making a fool of myself. Yes, I came back because I couldn't stand the thought of you losing everything when I had the power to prevent it. He took a breath, his eyes intense on hers. But I never expected anything from you. Not then, not now. I offered you a practical solution to a terrible problem. You accepted. If you'd remembered me, if you'd known the whole story, you might not have said yes. And I couldn't let my feelings get in the way of helping you when you needed it most. That's not your choice to make, Lillian said, but her voice lacked conviction. You should have told me. Maybe. But I didn't, and I won't apologize for it. Daniel's voice softened. What do you want from me, Lillian? You want me to leave? I'll go, but the money stays, the partnership stays. You keep everything I promised. You want me to pretend this conversation never happened? I can do that too. You want the truth laid out? You have it now. What do you want? She stared at him, this man who was somehow both a stranger and someone who'd known her better than she'd realized. The man who'd hidden his feelings for 15 years. The man who'd saved her without asking for credit. I don't know, she whispered. I don't know what I want. Then figure it out. He turned back to the horse, his shoulders tight with tension. But while you're figuring, know this. I kept those letters because they mattered to me. I didn't hide them very well because some part of me wanted you to find them eventually. And I married you knowing you might never feel the same way I do, and I'm okay with that. I'd rather be your partner in name only than not be part of your life at all. Lillian stood there clutching the tin box, her world tilted on its axis. Everything she thought she understood about their arrangement had just been rewritten. Daniel had loved her for 15 years. He'd built a life and come back for her. He'd saved her knowing she didn't remember him and might never love him back. The magnitude of it was overwhelming. I need time, she said finally, to process this. Take all the time you need. Daniel didn't turn around. Nothing has to change, Lillian. We can keep going exactly as we have been. This doesn't have to mean anything if you don't want it to. But they both knew that was a lie. Everything had changed the moment she'd opened that tin box. Lillian walked back to the house, her mind spinning. She sat in the darkened kitchen for hours, reading through the letters again by lamplight. Each one revealed a depth of feeling that should have frightened her but somehow didn't. This boy, this man, had seen her, really seen her. Not the struggling rancher's daughter trying to hold everything together, but the person underneath. The girl who cried over injured animals and laughed too loud and refused to quit even when things were impossible. He'd loved that girl enough to remember her for 15 years. And the man she'd married was the same person who'd written these words, even if she'd been too blind to see it. The question was, what was she going to do about it? The next morning arrived with heavy gray clouds and the smell of rain in the air. Lillian had barely slept, her mind replaying the conversation in the barn over and over until the words lost meaning and became just sounds echoing in her exhausted brain. She made coffee in the pre-dawn darkness, her hands moving through the familiar motions while her thoughts remained tangled in confusion. Daniel appeared in the kitchen doorway just as the first pot finished brewing. He looked like he hadn't slept either, shadows under his eyes and tension in his shoulders. They stared at each other across the kitchen, the weight of unspoken things filling the space between them. "Coffee's ready," Lillian said finally, because someone had to break the silence. "Thank you." Daniel poured himself a cup but didn't sit down. "I'll be working on the north fence today. Probably won't be back until evening." The implication was clear. He was giving her space, removing himself from her presence so she could think without the pressure of his proximity. It was considerate and infuriating in equal measure. "Daniel, we can't just pretend that conversation didn't happen." "I'm not pretending. I'm giving you time like you asked for." He met her eyes over the rim of his coffee cup. "What do you want me to do, Lillian? Stand here and defend myself? Apologize for caring about you? I can't change the past, and I won't apologize for trying to help you in the present." "I'm not asking you to apologize. I'm asking you to help me understand." She set down her own cup with more force than necessary. "You spent 15 years carrying feelings for someone who didn't even remember you existed. That's not normal, Daniel. That's not healthy." "You think I don't know that?" For the first time, frustration bled into his voice. "You think I didn't try to move on, meet other people, build a life that didn't revolve around memories of a girl I knew for 2 summers? I did all of that. It didn't change how I felt. So you came back to play savior and hope I'd eventually fall in love with you? Is that the plan?" Daniel's jaw tightened. "The plan was to help you because I could. Because watching you lose everything from a distance would have destroyed me more than you never loving me back. If that makes me pathetic or obsessed or whatever you're thinking right now, fine. But don't question my motives for the help I've given. It was real, and it was freely offered." He set down his coffee cup and headed for the door. "I'll be back for dinner. Or I won't, if you'd rather I stay away. Your choice." The door closed behind him with careful control. Not quite a slam, but close enough to make his frustration clear. Lillian stood alone in the kitchen, her coffee going cold, wondering how everything had gotten so complicated so quickly. Her father's voice called from his bedroom. "Lily, that you arguing with your husband at dawn?" She closed her eyes. Of course he'd heard. The walls in this old house had never been thick enough for privacy. "It's nothing, Dad. Go back to sleep." "Don't tell me it's nothing when I can hear the tension from here." Thomas's voice was stronger this morning, more alert. "Get in here and talk to me." Lillian found her father propped up in bed, his left hand trembling slightly as he reached for the water glass on his nightstand. She helped him drink, then sat in the chair beside the bed that had become her usual spot for their conversations. "You want to tell me what's going on?" Thomas asked. "Or should I guess?" "Daniel isn't who I thought he was." "None of us are, really. What did you find out?" So Lillian told him about the letters, about Daniel working on the ranch 15 years ago, about the quiet devotion that had somehow survived all those years. Her father listened without interrupting, his expression thoughtful. "I remember him," Thomas said when she finished. "Quiet kid, good worker. Kept to himself mostly. I didn't know he had feelings for you." "You remember him?" Lillian stared at her father. "Why didn't you say something when he showed up to marry me?" "Because he gave a different name back then. Went by his middle name, James. Daniel James Mercer. I didn't make the connection until just now." Thomas shifted against his pillows. "He tell you why he came back?" "He said he couldn't stand watching me lose everything when he could prevent it." "And that makes you angry?" "It makes me confused." Lillian stood up, pacing the small room. "He married me under false pretenses, Dad. He knew everything about me while I knew nothing about him. That's not a partnership. I don't even know what that is. It's a man who loved you enough to save you without asking for credit." Thomas's voice was gentle. "Lily, I know this isn't how you imagined your life going, but maybe instead of focusing on what he didn't tell you, you should think about what he did do. He showed up when no one else would. He kept every promise he made. He's treated you with nothing but respect. He lied by omission. He protected you from feeling obligated to emotions you might not be ready for." Her father reached out his trembling hand. "Sometimes the kindest thing we can do for people we love is give them space to come to their own conclusions." Lillian took her father's hand, feeling the tremor beneath her fingers. What if I can never feel the same way he does? What if I'm just grateful, not in love? Then you tell him the truth and figure out what kind of marriage you can build with honesty. But don't throw away something real just because it started complicated. Thomas squeezed her hand weakly. Life doesn't give us perfect situations, Lily. It gives us choices. You chose to marry him. Now you get to choose what kind of marriage you want it to be. The rain started mid-morning, a steady drumming on the roof that matched the restless rhythm of Lillian's thoughts. She threw herself into work, mucking out stalls and organizing the tack room, anything to keep her hands busy while her mind churned through everything she'd learned. The problem was that she couldn't untangle her feelings enough to know what she actually felt. Gratitude? Yes. Confusion? Absolutely. Anger at being kept in the dark, though that was fading the more she thought about her father's words. But underneath all of that was something else, something she didn't want to examine too closely. Because the truth was that Daniel's confession had changed how she saw him. The careful distance she'd maintained, the walls she'd built around herself to keep their arrangement purely business. All of it felt different now. Every interaction took on new meaning when viewed through the lens of 15 years of quiet devotion. The way he made her coffee exactly how she liked it. The way he'd known her ring size. The way he'd caught her when she fell from the barn roof with a fear in his eyes that went deeper than simple concern for an employee or business partner. He'd been protecting her all along, not just from financial ruin, but from the weight of his own feelings, and she'd been so focused on survival that she hadn't seen it. The rain intensified around noon, turning from steady drumming to a full downpour. Lillian was in the barn when she heard the truck pull up, earlier than expected. Daniel appeared in the doorway, soaked through, his hair plastered to his head. "North fence is down," he said without preamble. "Storm damage. 3 posts completely knocked over and about 30 feet of wire torn up. I can't fix it alone in this weather. We'll lose cattle if we don't get it secured." Lillian grabbed her rain jacket. "Show me where." They drove out to the north pasture in tense silence, the windshield wipers barely keeping up with the rain. The damage was worse than Daniel had described. Not just posts down, but a whole section of fence completely destroyed, with their small herd of cattle already starting to drift toward the gap. "We need to get them back and create a temporary barrier," Lillian shouted over the sound of the storm. "At least enough to keep them contained until the weather clears." They worked side by side in the pouring rain, herding confused cattle back from the fence line and securing what they could with spare posts and wire from the truck. The mud was ankle deep, the rain was blinding, and more than once Lillian slipped and nearly went down. Each time, Daniel was there, steadying her without comment. It took 3 hours to create a makeshift barrier that would hold until they could make proper repairs. By the time they climbed back into the truck, they were both covered in mud and shivering from the cold rain that had soaked through every layer of clothing. Daniel started the engine and cranked the heat. "You all right?" "Cold, wet, but fine." Lillian's teeth were chattering. "Thanks for catching me. Twice. Always." He said it so simply, like it was just a fact of his existence. Like catching her when she fell was as natural as breathing. The word hung between them, weighted with meaning neither of them addressed. They drove back to the ranch in silence again, but it felt different than the silence that morning. Less angry, more contemplative. When they reached the house, Daniel pulled clean towels from the hall closet and handed one to Lillian. "You should get out of those wet clothes before you catch pneumonia." "You too." She took the towel, their fingers brushing briefly. "Daniel, you don't have to say anything." He was already turning away. "I'm going to clean up and check on the horses. We can talk later if you want. Or not at all. Whatever you need." He disappeared up the stairs, leaving Lillian standing in the hallway with a towel and too many unspoken words crowding her throat. She changed into dry clothes and checked on her father, who was napping peacefully despite the storm. Then she found herself drawn back to the barn, to the loose floorboard and the tin box she'd replaced beneath it. The letters were still there, still tied with that faded ribbon. Lillian sat on the barn floor and read them again, more slowly this time, looking for clues she'd missed, trying to piece together the boy who'd written them with the man who'd married her. One letter in particular caught her attention. It was dated late summer, just before he would have left the ranch for good. "Tomorrow is my last day here. I've been trying to find the courage to say something, to tell you how I feel before I go. But every time I see you, the words die in my throat. What right do I have to complicate your life with feelings you didn't ask for? You're going places, Lillian Carter. You're going to do amazing things, and I'm just the hired help passing through. So I'll keep my silence. I'll leave tomorrow morning before dawn so I don't have to watch you not notice I'm gone. I'll carry these feelings with me and try to build a life worthy of them. And maybe someday, when I've made something of myself, when I have more to offer than just devotion and empty hands, I'll come back. I'll probably always wonder what might have happened if I'd been brave enough to speak, but I'd rather spend my life wondering than risk making you uncomfortable or putting you in an awkward position. Some things are better left unsaid. I hope life gives you everything you deserve. I hope someone braver than me tells you how extraordinary you are. I hope you never stop laughing by that creek. D. Lillian's hands trembled as she refolded the letter. He'd left planning to come back someday. He'd spent 15 years building something worthy of her. And when he'd finally returned, it hadn't been to claim her or demand she love him back. It had been to save her without asking for anything in return except the chance to be part of her life. The magnitude of that kind of patience, that kind of devotion, was staggering. She thought about all the men she'd dated over the years, the relationships that had fizzled out because they'd been based on superficial attraction or convenience. None of them had looked at her the way Daniel did. None of them had seen past the surface to the person underneath. But Daniel had, 15 years ago, and still now. The question her father had asked echoed in her mind. What kind of marriage do you want it to be? She didn't have an answer yet. But sitting there on the barn floor, reading words written by a boy who'd loved her enough to wait until he could actually help her, Lillian felt something shift inside her chest. Not love, not yet, but possibility. The beginning of something that might grow into love if she was brave enough to let it. The storm cleared around dinner time, leaving everything washed clean and dripping. Lillian made dinner while Daniel tended the animals, moving through the familiar routine with new awareness coloring every action. When he came in from the barn, cleaned up but still looking exhausted from the day's work, she had food waiting on the table. "Smells good," he said, surprise evident in his voice. "It's just stew, nothing fancy." Lillian ladled portions into bowls. "Sit down before it gets cold." They ate in silence for a few minutes, the only sound the scrape of spoons against ceramic. Finally, Lillian set down her spoon and met his eyes across the table. "I read the letters again. All of them." Daniel's hand stilled halfway to his mouth. And I think I'm starting to understand." She took a breath. "You asked me what I wanted. I told you I didn't know. I still don't, not completely. But I know what I don't want." "What's that?" "I don't want to keep pretending we're strangers. I don't want to keep acting like this is just a business arrangement when clearly it's more complicated than that." Lillian's voice steadied. "You knew me 15 years ago. You've apparently spent a significant portion of your adult life thinking about me. That's terrifying and confusing, and I don't know how to process it, but I'm tired of pretending the revelation doesn't change things." Daniel set down his spoon carefully. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying I want the truth between us. All of it. No more secrets, no more careful distance." She met his eyes. "You said you came back because you couldn't stand watching me lose everything, but that's not the whole truth, is it?" He was quiet for a long moment. When he spoke, his voice was raw with honesty. "No, that's not the whole truth." "Then tell me the rest." Daniel pushed back from the table and stood, pacing to the window before turning to face her. "I came back because in 15 years, I never stopped thinking about you. I dated other women, tried to build a life that didn't revolve around a memory, but nothing ever felt right. Every woman I met, I compared to you. Every relationship felt hollow because it wasn't with the person I actually wanted." He ran a hand through his hair, frustration and vulnerability warring in his expression. "When I heard about your situation, it felt like fate giving me a chance I didn't deserve. A chance to help you and maybe, if I was incredibly lucky, to be part of your life in some capacity. Even if that capacity was just as a business partner, even if you never felt anything for me beyond gratitude or tolerance. Why didn't you tell me this from the beginning? Because you were desperate and drowning, and the last thing you needed was emotional pressure from a stranger claiming to have loved you for over a decade." His voice cracked slightly. "I wanted to give you a lifeline without strings attached. If you knew how I felt, you might have said yes out of obligation or pity. I couldn't stand the thought of that." Lillian stood up, moving closer to him. So you married me planning to just, what, pine silently for the rest of your life? I married you planning to be whatever you needed me to be. If that meant a silent business partner, fine. If it meant a friend, better. If it ever meant something more, he met her eyes. Then I'd be the luckiest man alive. But I wasn't counting on it. That's not fair to you. It's not about fair, it's about loving someone enough to accept whatever relationship they're willing to give you. Daniel's voice softened. Lillian, I don't expect you to love me back. I don't expect you to feel anything beyond what you naturally feel. All I ask is that you let me care about you honestly instead of hiding it behind walls and distance. She stood there, inches away from him, studying his face. The sincerity in his eyes, the tension in his jaw, the vulnerability he was showing by laying all of this out without guarantee of reciprocation. This was a man who'd loved her when she was an oblivious teenager, and loved her still now when she was a struggling rancher tied to him by paperwork and necessity. I can't promise I'll ever feel the same way you do, she said quietly. I know. I can't promise this will turn into some fairy tale romance. I know that too. But I can promise I'll try. To know you, really know you. To give this, whatever this is, an honest chance instead of keeping you at arm's length. Lillian reached out tentatively, taking his hand. Can that be enough for now? Daniel's fingers closed around hers, warm and solid. That's more than enough. They stood there in the kitchen, holding hands like uncertain teenagers, while outside the storm-washed world grew dark. It wasn't a declaration of love or a dramatic reconciliation. It was just two people agreeing to try, to be honest, to see what might grow between them if they gave it space and light. But sometimes that was enough. Sometimes that was everything. The following days passed differently than the ones before. The careful distance between them didn't disappear overnight, but it softened, became something more like respect for boundaries than rigid walls. They worked together on the fence repairs. Daniel teaching Lillian techniques he'd learned over years of ranch management, Lillian sharing stories about growing up on this land that he listened to with quiet attention. In the evenings, they started talking, really talking. Daniel told her about the years after he'd left the ranch, about building his own place from nothing, about the loneliness that had driven him even as success came. Lillian shared her fears about her father's declining health, her grief over her mother's death, the desperate months before Daniel had appeared when she'd felt like she was drowning with no one to hear her scream for help. I used to imagine someone would show up and save us, she admitted one night while they were cleaning up after dinner. Like a character in some story, it felt ridiculous to even hope for it. And then I showed up. Daniel dried the plate she handed him. Was I what you imagined? No, you were better because you were real. You didn't make promises you couldn't keep or offer false hope. You just helped. She met his eyes. I'm glad it was you. Something warm flickered in his expression. Me too. Her father noticed the change between them, commenting on it one afternoon while Lillian was helping him with his exercises. You two seem less awkward around each other. We're trying to actually know each other instead of just coexisting. Lillian guided his arm through the stretches the physical therapist had prescribed. It's slow, but it's progress. He's a good man, Lily. I can see that now. Thomas winced as she stretched his weakened muscles. Question is, can you see it? I'm starting to. She eased up on the pressure. He's not what I expected, but maybe that's not a bad thing. Most of the best things in life aren't what we expect. Her father's eyes were knowing. Just don't close yourself off to possibilities because you're scared of being hurt. I'm not scared of being hurt. I'm scared of not being able to love him back the way he deserves. Then stop trying to force feelings and just let them develop naturally. Thomas caught her hand. You don't have to decide right now if you're going to fall in love with him. Just decide if you're going to give him a fair chance. The rest will work itself out. It was practical advice, and Lillian tried to follow it. She stopped analyzing every interaction, stopped measuring her feelings against some imagined standard of what love should feel like. Instead, she just paid attention to who Daniel was when he wasn't hiding behind careful distance. She noticed how he always made sure her father's medications were organized and on time, how he fixed the little things around the house without being asked, The squeaky hinge, the loose cabinet handle, the draft in the window. How he talked to the horses like they were old friends, his voice gentle and patient. She noticed how he looked at her sometimes when he thought she wasn't watching, with an expression that was equal parts longing and contentment, like just being near her was enough, even if he couldn't have more. And slowly, carefully, she started noticing how she felt around him. The security of knowing he was there, the comfort of his steady presence, the way her day felt incomplete until they'd shared the evening meal and talked about everything and nothing. It wasn't love, not yet, but it was the soil love could grow in if she let it. 3 weeks after she'd found the letters, Lillian made a decision. She was in the barn organizing supplies when Daniel came in from checking the cattle, his shirt dusty and his hair tousled from the wind. "Got a minute?" she asked before she could lose her nerve. "Always." "What do you need?" Lillian pulled the tin box from where she'd kept it hidden on a high shelf. "I need you to tell me about these. Not the fact that you wrote them, I know that now. But what you were thinking, what you were feeling. I want to understand who you were then." Daniel stared at the box, something vulnerable crossing his face. "Why?" "Because those letters are part of your story, part of our story, whether I knew it at the time or not." She held the box out to him. "And I want to know the whole story, not just the parts I was present for." He took the box with careful hands, like it held something precious and fragile. "Where do you want me to start?" "The beginning. Tell me about the boy who came to work on this ranch and fell for the boss's daughter." So Daniel told her about being 19 and broke, taking any work he could find. About the first day he'd arrived and seen her laughing with friends by the barn, the sunlight catching in her hair. About how she'd been kind to him in a casual way that probably meant nothing to her, but everything to him. He told her about watching her work with the horses, her patience and skill evident even at 16. About the day she'd helped him when he'd cut his hand on barbed wire, cleaning the wound with gentle efficiency while scolding him for being careless. About how she'd talked to him like a person rather than just hired help, asking about his life, his plans, his dreams. "You probably don't remember any of that," Daniel said, turning one of the letters over in his hands. "I was just background noise in your life, but you were everything to mine that summer." "I wish I did remember." And Lillian meant it. She wanted to remember the boy he'd been, wanted to have those memories to match against the man he'd become. "Maybe it's better that you don't. I was young and foolish and probably showed my feelings more than I thought I did." He smiled slightly. "Your father definitely knew. He warned me once to keep my focus on work and my eyes to myself." Lillian laughed, surprised. "He never told me that." "Because I listened. I kept my distance, did my job, and wrote letters I never planned to send instead of making things awkward for everyone." Daniel looked up at her. "When I left that last summer, I genuinely thought I'd never come back. I thought the best thing I could do was build a life elsewhere and let you live yours without some lovesick kid hanging around." "But you did come back." "Because life doesn't always let us escape our first loves. And because when I heard you needed help, every instinct I had said to come back, even if it meant risking my heart all over again." He set the letters down carefully. "I don't regret it, Lillian. Even if you never love me back, I don't regret trying to save you." She sat down beside him on the hay bale, their shoulders nearly touching. "I'm not the girl you remember. That carefree teenager is gone. I'm harder now, more cynical. I've got baggage and responsibilities, and I'm probably not nearly as interesting as your memories made me out to be." "I know exactly who you are." Daniel turned to face her. "I know you're exhausted from months of carrying everything alone. I know you're scared of your father dying and leaving you completely isolated. I know you put on a brave face even when you're terrified inside. And I know you're one of the strongest people I've ever met because you're still standing when most people would have crumbled." The intensity in his voice made her throat tight. "You see too much. I see you, the real you, not some idealized memory." He reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away, and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "And I like what I see, Lillian. Past and present, both." Her breath caught at the gentleness of the gesture, the warmth in his eyes. For the first time since she'd married him, Lillian let herself really look at Daniel Mercer. Not as the stranger who'd saved her or the boy from letters, but as the man sitting beside her right now. The lines around his eyes from years of squinting into the sun, the calluses on his hands from hard work, the quiet strength in the way he held himself. He was handsome in an understated way she hadn't let herself notice before. And more than that, he was kind, patient, real. "I don't know if I can ever feel about you the way you feel about me," she said softly. "I know. But I'd like to try, to really try, not just go through the motions." Daniel's eyes searched hers. "What does that mean?" Lillian took a breath, gathering her courage. "It means no more separate lives under the same roof. It means actually being partners, not just on paper. It means I want to get to know you, the real you, and see what grows between us if we're honest with each other. And if nothing grows? Then at least we tried with open eyes instead of hiding behind walls." She managed a small smile. "My father said I should give you a fair chance instead of just being grateful you saved us. So that's what I'm doing, giving you a fair chance." Daniel was very still, like he was afraid any sudden movement might shatter the moment. "That's all I ever wanted. Just a chance." They sat there in the barn as afternoon light slanted through the gaps in the walls, surrounded by the smell of hay and leather and the comfortable sounds of horses moving in their stalls. It wasn't a dramatic declaration or a passionate kiss. It was just two people agreeing to be honest with each other, to try building something real instead of hiding behind convenience and distance. But sometimes the quiet moments were the ones that changed everything. That evening, something fundamental shifted in the house. It wasn't dramatic. There was no grand gesture or passionate reconciliation. But when Daniel came down from his room after cleaning up for dinner, Lillian found herself noticing details she'd deliberately ignored before. The way his still damp hair curled slightly at his collar. The faint scar on his jaw she'd never asked about. The way he moved through the kitchen with quiet confidence, like he belonged there and always had. "You're staring," he said without looking up from the vegetables he was chopping. Lillian felt heat rise in her cheeks. "I'm observing. There's a difference." "Is there?" The corner of his mouth quirked up in what might have been a smile. "I'm trying to actually see you instead of just looking past you. That's what partners do, right? They pay attention." Daniel set down the knife and turned to face her fully, his expression serious. "Lillian, I need you to understand something. This, us trying, it doesn't mean you owe me anything. Not affection, not romance, nothing beyond what you genuinely feel. If you're doing this out of obligation, I'm not." She stepped closer, surprising them both. "I'm doing this because I want to know who you really are. Because maybe my father is right, and I've been so focused on survival that I haven't let myself actually live. And what if you get to know me and decide you don't like what you find? Then at least we'll both know the truth instead of spending our lives wondering." Lillian reached out and touched his arm lightly. "You took a gamble on me, Daniel. 15 years is a long time to carry feelings for someone who might never return them. The least I can do is take a gamble on you, too." His eyes searched hers, looking for something she wasn't sure she could give yet. But what he found must have been enough because he nodded slowly. "All right, we try. Honestly." "Honestly," she agreed. They finished making dinner together, moving around each other in the kitchen with a new awareness. When their hands brushed reaching for the same pot, neither of them pulled away immediately. When Daniel tasted the sauce and declared it perfect, Lillian felt an absurd flush of pleasure at the simple compliment. Over dinner, with her father listening from his room where they'd set up a small table so he could join them, Daniel told stories about the years between leaving the ranch and coming back. About working construction in Colorado, saving every penny. About buying his first piece of land with money he'd barely had. About the loneliness of building something alone while watching other people build lives with partners who chose them freely. "I envied them," he admitted, pushing food around his plate. "The couples I'd see in town, the families at church on Sundays. Not because I wanted what they had specifically, but because they had someone who'd chosen them. Someone who wanted to build a life with them. Not out of necessity or arrangement, but because they actually wanted to." "Is that what you want from this?" Lillian asked quietly. "For me to want you, not just accept you?" Daniel met her eyes. "I want you to be happy. If that includes wanting me, then yes, I'd like that very much. But your happiness matters more than my desires." That's a terrible way to approach a relationship. Maybe, but it's the only way I know how to love you. The words hung in the air between them, weighted with 15 years of meaning. Lillian's father cleared his throat from his room, a pointed reminder that they weren't alone, and the moment passed. But something had been acknowledged, put into words that couldn't be taken back. After dinner, Thomas called them both into his room. He was sitting up straighter than usual, his good hand gripping the bed rail for support, his expression more alert than Lillian had seen in weeks. "I've been listening to you two dance around each other for days now," he said, without preamble. "And I'm going to say something that might make you both uncomfortable, but I'm old and sick and I don't have time for subtlety anymore." "Dad," Lillian started, but he waved her off. "Lily, I raised you to be strong and independent, and you are. But I also raised you to recognize when you're being stubborn for the wrong reasons. This man came into your life offering help when you needed it most. He's kept every promise he made. He treats you with respect and kindness. And unless I'm completely misreading things, he loves you in a way most people only dream about." "Mr. Carter, you don't need to—" Daniel tried, but Thomas cut him off too. "And you're so busy trying not to pressure her that you're practically invisible. She can't fall in love with a ghost boy. If you want a real marriage instead of a business arrangement, you're going to have to actually be present. Show her who you are, not just who you think she needs you to be." Lillian and Daniel exchanged glances, both of them slightly stunned by the older man's directness. "I know I won't be around much longer," Thomas continued, his voice softening. "The doctors don't say it plainly, but I can feel myself getting weaker. And before I go, I want to know that my daughter has someone who'll stand by her, not out of obligation or old promises, but because they choose to, every single day." "Dad, don't talk like that. It's the truth, Lily, and you know it." He reached out his trembling hand to her. "I'm not afraid of dying. I'm afraid of leaving you alone. But if you two can figure out how to actually be partners, real partners, then maybe I can rest easy knowing you'll be all right." Lillian took her father's hand, tears burning her eyes. "You're not going anywhere yet. The new treatment Daniel arranged is helping. It's buying time, not curing me. We all know that." Thomas looked at Daniel. "You promise me something, son. Promise me that whether she loves you back or not, you'll look after her. Not because of your arrangement or because you feel obligated, but because she deserves someone in her corner." "I promise," Daniel said without hesitation. "I'll always be in her corner, sir, no matter what." Thomas nodded, satisfied. "Good. Now get out of here, both of you. An old man needs his rest, and you two need to figure out what kind of life you're building together." They left him to sleep, but the conversation stayed with Lillian. She found Daniel on the porch later, staring out at the darkened pastures, his shoulders tense. "He's right, you know," she said, joining him at the railing. "You do make yourself invisible sometimes, like you're afraid of taking up too much space in my life." "Because I am afraid of that." Daniel didn't look at her. "For 15 years, I existed in your life as someone you didn't even remember. Taking up space now feels like overstepping, like claiming something I haven't earned." "You've earned it, Daniel. You've more than earned it." Lillian took a breath. "But my father is right about something else, too. I can't fall in love with someone I don't really know, and I can't know you if you're always holding yourself back." He finally turned to face her. "What do you want to know?" "Everything. The good, the bad, the parts you think might scare me off." She met his eyes. "You know everything about me. My struggles, my fears, my worst moments. It's not fair that I know so little about you." Daniel was quiet for a long moment, his jaw working. "All right, but not out here in the cold. Come on." He led her inside to the living room, where a fire was already burning in the stone fireplace. They sat on the worn couch that had been in the Carter family for 3 generations, and for the first time since they'd married, they sat close enough that their knees almost touched. "What do you want to know first?" Daniel asked. "The scar on your jaw. Where'd it come from?" His hand moved unconsciously to touch it. "Bar fight in Denver about 8 years ago. Some drunk took offense to something I said, or didn't say. I never figured out which. Caught me with a broken bottle before I could get out of the way." "That must have hurt." "Less than you'd think. I was pretty numb to most things back then." He leaned back against the couch. Those years after I left here were hard, Lillian. I worked myself half to death trying to build something, trying to become someone worthy of the girl I couldn't forget. But no matter how much money I made or land I bought, I still felt empty. Because you were alone. Because I was chasing a memory instead of building a real life. He looked at her. I dated women, tried to move on. There was one, Sarah her name was. We were together for almost 2 years. She was kind, smart, everything anyone could want. And I thought maybe I could learn to love her the way I loved you. Lillian felt an unexpected twist in her chest at the mention of another woman. What happened? She figured out that I was settling, that I was trying to make myself love her because it was practical, not because I actually did. Daniel's voice was heavy with old regret. She deserved better than that. So she left, and I didn't blame her. Can't build a relationship on trying to force feelings that aren't there. Is that what you think we're doing? Trying to force feelings? No, because I already have feelings for you. The question is whether you can develop them for me. He shifted to face her more fully. And I need you to know, if you can't, if this stays a partnership without romance, I meant what I said. I'd rather have that than nothing. I'd rather be your friend and partner than lose you entirely trying to force something that isn't there. Lillian studied his face, the sincerity in his dark eyes, the tension in his shoulders. This was a man who'd loved her longer than some marriages lasted, who'd saved her without asking for credit, who was willing to accept whatever scraps of affection she could give rather than demand the love he'd spent 15 years earning. It should have felt like pressure. Instead, it felt like freedom. The freedom to explore these growing feelings without fear that he'd leave if she didn't love him fast enough or completely enough. Tell me about the first time you saw me, she said impulsively. Not the letters version, the real memory. A faint smile crossed Daniel's face, transforming his serious expression into something softer. It was my first day working here. I was 19, broke, sleeping in my truck most nights because I couldn't afford rent. Your father hired me to help with fence repairs, and I showed up early because I needed the work desperately. He settled back, his eyes going distant with memory. You came out of the barn leading this massive bay mare that looked half wild. She was dancing around, tossing her head, and your father started to say something, probably to warn you to be careful, but you just laughed and told him she was feeling frisky because of the spring weather. Nothing to worry about. Duchess, Lillian breathed, remembering. That was Duchess. She was always temperamental in the spring. You had this way with her, firm but gentle, never forcing but never backing down either. You led her around the yard for maybe 20 minutes, working through her energy, talking to her the whole time. Daniel's voice was warm with the memory. And then you noticed me standing there staring like an idiot, and you smiled and said good morning like it was completely normal for some strange kid to be watching you work with your horse. I don't remember that at all. I know, but I remember everything about it. The way the morning sun made your hair look almost golden, the mud on your boots and the confidence in your hands, the sound of your laugh when Duchess finally settled down. He met her eyes. That's when I knew I was in trouble. Before you'd even said 10 words to me. Lillian felt something warm unfurl in her chest. What did I say? Those first 10 words? You asked if I was the new hire, told me your name, and said you hoped my first day went well. Then you went back to working with Duchess. Daniel smiled slightly. 30 seconds of interaction, and I was completely gone. Pathetic, really. It's not pathetic, it's... Lillian searched for the right word. It's honest. You felt what you felt. I felt too much, too fast. Spent that whole first summer trying to convince myself it was just attraction, that it would fade. But then I got to know you, really know you, and it only got worse. He ran a hand through his hair. You were kind to everyone. You worked harder than any of the hired hands. You had this way of seeing the best in things, even when they were difficult. And you loved this land with a fierceness that was beautiful to watch. I was also arrogant and naive, Lillian countered. I thought I knew everything about running a ranch when I barely knew anything. You were 17. Everyone's arrogant at 17. Daniel's expression grew more serious. But even then, you had this core of strength, this determination to prove you could handle anything. I saw it when you dealt with that injured calf, the one the vet said wouldn't make it. Lillian remembered. Clover, she survived. Because you refused to give up on her. You stayed up 3 nights straight caring for her, and your father tried to tell you it was a waste of time, but you wouldn't listen. Daniel's voice gentled. That's who you were then. And that's who you are now. Someone who fights for what matters, even when everyone says it's hopeless. The words hit deeper than Lillian expected. She'd spent so long feeling like a failure, failing to save the ranch finances, failing to help her father's health, failing at everything she touched, that she'd forgotten she'd ever been a fighter. I don't feel very strong anymore, she admitted quietly, because you've been fighting alone for too long. Strength isn't about never needing help, Lillian. It's about keeping going even when you do. Daniel reached out slowly, taking her hand. Let me help carry the weight. That's what partners do. His hand was warm around hers, calloused from work, but gentle in its touch. Lillian looked down at their joined hands and felt something shift inside her. This wasn't the desperate gratitude she'd felt when he'd first proposed. This was something else, something that felt dangerously like the beginning of actual affection. I'm scared, she whispered. Of what? Of this. Of you. Of feeling too much and getting hurt when it doesn't work out. She met his eyes. Of not being able to love you the way you deserve to be loved. Daniel squeezed her hand gently. Then we'll take it slow. One day at a time. No pressure, no expectations beyond honesty. He paused. And for what it's worth, I'm scared too. You? Of what? Of hoping too much. Of letting myself believe you might actually care about me and then losing you anyway. His voice roughened. I've loved you for 15 years, Lillian. If this doesn't work out, it'll break something in me that probably can't be fixed, but I'm willing to risk it if you are. The vulnerability in his admission made her chest ache. She thought about everything he'd told her tonight, the bar fight scar, the failed relationship, the years of loneliness. He'd given her pieces of himself he probably didn't share easily, trusting her with his truth even though she couldn't yet give him what he wanted most. I'm willing to risk it, she said finally. I can't promise it'll work out the way you want, but I can promise I'll try, really try. That's all I'm asking for. They sat there on the couch, hands joined, watching the fire burn down to embers. It was late enough that Lillian should have been exhausted, but she found herself reluctant to end the conversation, to retreat back to separate rooms and separate lives. Will you tell me more, she asked, about the years between then and now? I want to know what shaped you into who you are. So Daniel told her about working construction until his hands bled, about saving every penny and learning everything he could about ranch management, about buying his first 50 acres with money he'd borrowed from a bank that probably shouldn't have approved the loan, about building his herd one animal at a time, living in a trailer on the property because he couldn't afford both a house and cattle. I was obsessed with success, he admitted, not because I particularly cared about money, but because I had this idea that if I could just become successful enough, impressive enough, maybe I'd be worthy of someone like you. It was stupid logic, but it drove me for years. It's not stupid, it's human. Lillian found her thumb tracing circles on the back of his hand without conscious thought. We all want to be worthy of the people we love. But worthiness isn't about money or success. I know that now. Daniel turned his hand over, lacing their fingers together. It's about character, about how you treat people when no one's watching, about whether you keep your promises and stand by your commitments even when things get hard. You do all of those things. I try. Doesn't always work out, but I try. He was quiet for a moment. Can I ask you something? Anything. What made you say yes to my proposal? The real reason, not just the financial necessity. Lillian thought back to that morning on the porch when a stranger had offered her an impossible solution. Honestly, you seemed safe. You didn't make big promises or try to charm me. You laid out the terms clearly and gave me a choice. After months of feeling powerless, having a choice felt like everything. Even if the choice was between marrying a stranger or losing everything, it was still a choice. And something about you, the way you looked at me maybe, or the calm way you spoke, made me feel like I could trust you. She met his eyes. Was I right to trust you? Yes. No hesitation, no qualification, just absolute certainty. Then I made the right choice. The clock on the mantel chimed midnight, breaking the spell of the moment. Lillian realized with surprise that they'd been talking for hours, sharing pieces of themselves in the firelight while the world slept around them. "I should let you get some rest," Daniel said, though he didn't immediately release her hand. "I'm not tired." It was true. Despite the late hour, Lillian felt more awake than she had in months. "But you're probably exhausted. You were up before dawn working on that irrigation issue." "I'm fine." He smiled slightly. "This is better than sleep anyway." "Talking to me?" "Getting to know you, the real you, not the memory I carried for 15 years. Daniel's thumb brushed across her knuckles. "You're even more remarkable than I remembered." The compliment sent warmth through her chest. "You're not what I expected either." "Good, unexpected, or bad unexpected?" "Good. Definitely good." Lillian realized she meant it completely. "You're kind without being weak, strong without being domineering, patient without being passive. I don't think I've ever met anyone quite like you." "That's because I've had 15 years to figure out who I want to be. Most people don't get that much time for self-reflection." He said it lightly, but Lillian heard the weight beneath the words. 15 years of loneliness and longing had shaped him into someone capable of this kind of patient devotion. They finally separated around 1 in the morning, both of them reluctant but acknowledging the practical need for sleep. At the bottom of the stairs, Daniel paused. "Lillian?" "Yes?" "Thank you. For giving me a chance, for listening tonight, for not running away when you found out the truth." He looked like he wanted to say more, but settled for a simple, "Good night." "Good night, Daniel." She watched him climb the stairs to his room, then stood in the hallway for a long moment, her hand still warm from his touch. Something fundamental had shifted tonight. She'd started the evening determined to keep emotional distance, to protect herself from feelings she wasn't ready for. But somewhere in the hours of conversation, in the shared vulnerabilities and honest admissions, that distance had dissolved. She didn't love him. Not yet. But she could feel herself falling, slowly and inevitably, towards something that might become love if she let it. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, it felt like possibility. In her room, Lillian changed for bed, but found herself too restless to sleep. She pulled out the tin box of letters she'd kept in her nightstand and read through them again, but this time they felt different. Less like messages from a stranger, and more like pieces of the man she was beginning to know. One letter in particular caught her attention. It was shorter than the others, just a few lines. "I think the hardest part of loving you from a distance is knowing I could make you happy if you gave me the chance. Not because I'm special or perfect, but because I pay attention. I notice what makes you smile, what frustrates you, what you need before you ask for it. That's what love does. It makes you attentive to the details of someone else's life. Someday, maybe someone will notice those details about you and love you the way you deserve. I hope they treasure every moment of it, because losing the chance to love you openly would be the greatest regret of my life." Lillian read the words twice, then a third time, feeling tears prick her eyes. He'd written this 15 years ago, accepting even then that he might never get to love her openly. And yet he'd come back anyway, taken the risk anyway, offered her everything without guarantee of return. That kind of devotion should have felt suffocating. Instead, it felt like the safest thing in the world. She fell asleep with the letter on her nightstand and Daniel's voice echoing in her mind, talking about worthiness and choices, and taking things one day at a time. And for the first time since her father's stroke, since the debts had started piling up, since her world had begun crumbling, Lillian fell asleep feeling something that might have been hope. The next morning arrived with brilliant sunshine and unseasonably warm weather. Lillian woke to the smell of coffee and bacon and found Daniel in the kitchen making breakfast with a competence that suggested he'd been doing it for years. "Morning," he said, glancing up from the stove. "Sleep well?" "Better than I have in months." She poured herself coffee, very aware of his presence in a way she hadn't been before. "You didn't have to make breakfast." "I wanted to. Besides, your father's awake and asking for food. Figured I'd make enough for all of us." They ate together at the kitchen table, her father joining them in his wheelchair for the first time in weeks. Thomas noticed immediately the shift between them, the way they sat closer than before, the comfortable quiet that had replaced the awkward distance. "You two work things out?" he asked bluntly. "We're working on it," Lillian said, meeting Daniel's eyes across the table. "Taking it one day at a time." "Good. That's all anyone can do." Thomas took a bite of bacon, then fixed Daniel with a serious look. "You hurt my daughter, and I'll haunt you when I'm gone. Fair warning." "Fair warning received, sir." Daniel's lips quirked. "Though I should tell you, I'm more afraid of Lillian herself than any ghost." "As you should be." Thomas looked satisfied. "She's tougher than both of us put together." After breakfast, Daniel suggested they ride out to check the far pastures, something they hadn't done together since he'd arrived. Lillian agreed, and they saddled horses in comfortable quiet, their movements synchronized in a way that suggested growing familiarity. The ride took them through the most beautiful parts of the ranch. Rolling hills still green from recent rain, creeks running clear and cold, stands of pine trees that had been there since before her grandfather bought the land. Daniel rode beside her, occasionally pointing out things that needed attention, but mostly just taking in the view with quiet appreciation. "I'd forgotten how beautiful it is out here," Lillian admitted as they stopped at a high point overlooking the valley. "I've been so focused on surviving that I forgot to actually see it. It is beautiful, worth saving." Daniel's gaze swept across the landscape. "Worth everything it took to keep it." She looked at him then, really looked at him. The man who'd appeared offering salvation when she'd needed it most. The boy who'd loved her silently for 2 summers. The patient soul who'd waited 15 years for a chance he'd never been guaranteed. "Daniel?" "Yes?" "I'm glad it was you." The words came out softer than she intended. "I'm glad you were the one who came back. Not just because you saved the ranch, but because I think you were exactly what I needed, even if I didn't know it." He turned to her, something vulnerable and hopeful in his expression. "You mean that?" "I do." And she did, completely. They rode back to the ranch in silence, but it was the comfortable silence of 2 people who'd begun to truly understand each other. And when they reached the barn and Daniel helped her dismount, his hands lingering at her waist just a moment longer than necessary, Lillian didn't pull away. She let herself feel the warmth of his touch. Let herself acknowledge the growing affection that was slowly, steadily transforming their arranged marriage into something real. It wasn't love yet, but it was becoming something that looked a lot like it. And somewhere between that moment in the barn and the days that followed, something remarkable happened. The careful distance that had defined their marriage began to dissolve, not all at once, but in small increments that added up to transformation. Daniel stopped retreating to his room immediately after dinner. Lillian stopped treating their conversations like business meetings. They started existing in the same space without the constant awareness that they were playing roles rather than living lives. The change was subtle enough that Lillian couldn't pinpoint exactly when it happened. Maybe it was the morning she woke to find Daniel had already fed the horses and started coffee, leaving her a note that simply said, "Sleep in, you needed it." Maybe it was the afternoon they spent repairing the barn roof together, working in comfortable silence punctuated by easy conversation. Or maybe it was the evening she found him reading to her father from the newspaper, his voice patient and clear as Thomas listened with his eyes closed. "He falls asleep during the boring parts," Daniel explained when he noticed her in the doorway. "But he likes knowing what's happening in the world." "You don't have to do that," Lillian said softly. "I know, but I want to." Daniel marked his place in the paper. "He's family now. This is what family does." The casual way he said it, like her father being his family was just a simple fact rather than something earned through blood, made something in Lillian's chest crack open a little wider. 2 weeks after their conversation in the barn, her father's condition took a sudden turn. Lillian woke in the middle of the night to the sound of labored breathing coming from his room. She found Thomas struggling to breathe, his face pale, and his left hand clutching at his chest. "Dad!" She rushed to his side, her hands shaking as she reached for his pulse. "Dad, stay with me. Daniel!" She didn't even think about calling for him, didn't question whether he'd come. She just knew he would. Daniel appeared in the doorway within seconds, already pulling on a shirt over his sleep pants, his face alert despite the late hour. He took in the situation with one quick glance and moved to the bedside phone. "I'm calling an ambulance. Keep him calm." The next hour passed in a blur of paramedics, medical equipment, and the surreal experience of watching her father loaded into an ambulance, while Daniel stood beside her with a steadying hand on her shoulder. When they asked who was riding with the patient, Daniel answered before she could. "She is. I'll follow in my truck." At the hospital, Lillian sat in a sterile waiting room while doctors worked on her father, Daniel, beside her holding her hand like it was the most natural thing in the world. She should have told him he didn't need to stay, that she could handle this alone like she'd handled everything else for months. But the truth was, she didn't want to handle it alone. She wanted him there, needed his quiet strength anchoring her while her world threatened to come apart again. "He's going to be okay," Daniel said quietly. "He's tougher than he looks." "You can't know that." "No, but I can believe it, and so can you." He squeezed her hand gently. "Your father's a fighter. He's not done yet." Lillian leaned against his shoulder without thinking about it, and Daniel's arm came around her like he'd been waiting for permission to hold her. They sat like that for 2 hours until a doctor finally emerged with news. "Mr. Carter is stable," the doctor said. "It was a minor heart event, not a full heart attack. We've got him on medication and he's resting comfortably. You can see him in a few minutes." The relief was so overwhelming that Lillian felt her knees go weak. Daniel's arm tightened around her, holding her up. "See? Told you he was tough," he murmured against her hair. When they were finally allowed into Thomas's room, they found him looking small and fragile against the white hospital sheets, but his eyes were alert and focused on his daughter. "Stop looking at me like I'm dying," he said, his words slightly slurred but understandable. "Takes more than a little chest pain to kill a Carter." "Dad, you scared me to death." Lillian took his hand, careful of the IV line. "Sorry about that. Wasn't exactly fun from my end either." Thomas looked past her to Daniel. "You take care of her while I was out?" "Always do, sir." "Good man." Thomas's eyes drifted closed, then opened again with effort. "Lily, listen to me. I need to say something while I still can say it clearly." "Dad, you're fine. The doctor said—" "I'm not fine. I'm dying, just slower than we thought." He cut off her protest with a weak wave of his hand. "I've made my peace with it, but I need to know you'll be all right when I'm gone, that you won't be alone." Lillian felt tears burn her throat. "I won't be alone. Daniel will be here." "Will he?" Thomas looked at Daniel with surprising sharpness. "Or is this still just a business arrangement that ends when the old man dies?" "It was never just business," Daniel said firmly. "Not for me. And it ends when Lillian says it ends, not a moment before." "And you?" Thomas turned his gaze to his daughter. "What is this to you, Lily? Because if you're still treating this man like hired help instead of the husband who loves you, you're a fool." The bluntness of it shocked her into honesty. "I don't know what this is yet, Dad, but I'm trying to figure it out." "Then figure it out faster. Life's too short to waste time pretending you don't feel things you actually feel." Thomas's voice was getting weaker. "I see the way you look at him when you think no one's watching. I see the way you lean on him now when you used to carry everything alone. That's not gratitude, Lily. That's the beginning of love." "Mr. Carter, she doesn't need pressure right now," Daniel started, but Thomas shook his head. "She needs truth. And the truth is that life doesn't wait for us to be ready. It just happens, ready or not." He looked between them. "You two have a chance at something real. Don't waste it because you're both too scared to admit what you're feeling." The doctor returned then to check Thomas's vitals and shooed them out so he could rest. Lillian and Daniel found themselves back in the waiting room, the weight of her father's words hanging between them. "He's not wrong, you know," Lillian said finally, "about the way I look at you." Daniel went very still beside her. "What are you saying?" "I'm saying that somewhere between finding those letters and tonight, something changed. I stopped seeing you as the stranger who saved me and started seeing you as you, Daniel. The man who makes coffee exactly how I like it and reads to my father and catches me when I fall." She turned to face him fully. "The man I'm terrified of loving because if I lose you too, I don't think I'll survive it." "You won't lose me." Daniel's voice was rough with emotion. "Lillian, I've waited 15 years for you. I'm not going anywhere." You can't promise that. People leave. People die. I can promise that as long as I'm breathing, I'll be here. That's a promise I can make. He took both her hands in his. And I can promise that loving you is the easiest thing I've ever done. The hard part was pretending I didn't. Lillian felt tears spill over, all the emotion of the night overwhelming her defenses. I'm not there yet. I can't say I love you back, not honestly, but I think I'm falling, slowly, and it terrifies me. Then fall slowly. I'll catch you, just like I always do. Daniel pulled her into his arms, and Lillian let herself collapse against his chest, let herself be held while she cried out months of fear and exhaustion and grief. They stayed at the hospital until dawn, when the nurses assured them Thomas was stable and sleeping peacefully. Daniel drove them home through the early morning light, and Lillian watched his profile as he drove, this man who'd somehow become essential to her existence without her even noticing it happening. At the house, exhaustion hit them both. Daniel started toward the stairs, presumably heading to his room, but Lillian caught his hand. "Don't," she said quietly. He turned, confusion and hope warring in his expression. "Don't what?" "Don't go to your room. Don't go back to separate lives and careful distance." She took a shaky breath. "Stay with me. Just stay." Understanding dawned in his eyes. "Lillian, you're exhausted and emotional. You don't have to." "I know I don't have to. I want to." She squeezed his hand. "I don't want to be alone right now. And I don't want you to be alone either. So please, stay with me." They climbed the stairs together, hands linked, and for the first time since they'd married, Daniel followed Lillian into her room. It was innocent. They both collapsed onto the bed fully clothed, too exhausted to do anything but hold each other. But it was also monumental, the final wall between them coming down. Lillian fell asleep wrapped in Daniel's arms, his heartbeat steady beneath her ear, and for the first time in longer than she could remember, she felt completely safe. She woke to afternoon sunlight and the realization that Daniel was still there, still holding her, his breathing deep and even in sleep. She studied his face in the light, the strong lines softened by sleep, the dark lashes against his cheeks. He looked younger like this, more like the boy who'd written those letters than the man who'd saved her. As if sensing her gaze, his eyes opened. For a moment they just looked at each other, the intimacy of waking up together still new and precious. "Hi," Daniel said softly. "Hi." Lillian smiled, surprising herself. "We slept the whole day away." "We needed it." He reached up to tuck a strand of hair behind her ear, the gesture so tender it made her chest ache. "How are you feeling?" "Better. Scared about Dad, but better." She paused. "Daniel, about what I said at the hospital. You don't have to explain. You were emotional, worried about your father." "I meant it." She cut him off firmly. "Every word. I'm falling for you, and it terrifies me, but it's real." Daniel's breath caught. "You mean that?" "I do." Lillian shifted closer, closing the small distance between them. "I can't tell you exactly when it happened. Maybe it was finding the letters. Maybe it was all those conversations where you let me see who you really are. Maybe it started the moment you caught me falling from that barn roof. But somewhere along the way, you stopped being the stranger I married and became the person I can't imagine living without." "Lillian," his voice was thick with emotion. "Let me finish." She pressed her fingers gently to his lips. "I need to say this while I have the courage. You've loved me patiently for 15 years. You saved me when I needed it most. You've been kind to my father, honest with me, and more patient than anyone has a right to be. And I think—" She took a shaky breath. "I think I'm falling in love with you. Not the memory of you, not the idea of you, but the real you, the man lying here with me right now." Daniel closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, they were bright with unshed tears. "Say that again." "I'm falling in love with you, Daniel Mercer." He kissed her then, slow and sweet and full of 15 years of longing finally allowed expression. Lillian kissed him back, pouring into it all the feelings she'd been too scared to acknowledge. When they finally broke apart, both of them were breathing hard. "I love you," Daniel said against her lips. "I've loved you so long, I don't remember what it's like not to love you." "Then don't stop." Lillian smiled through her tears. Don't ever stop. They spent the afternoon in bed, not making love. That would come later, when the timing was right and the emotions less raw. But just talking, kissing, learning the feel of each other without the barriers they'd kept between them. Daniel told her about every letter he'd written and never sent, every moment he'd watched her and fallen deeper. Lillian confessed how she'd started noticing little things about him, how his presence had become essential without her realizing it. When did you know? Daniel asked, his fingers tracing lazy patterns on her arm. That you were falling? Honestly, I think part of me knew the night we talked in the barn. When you told me about Sarah and the years of loneliness. I saw the real you then, not the careful version you'd been showing me, and I liked what I saw. Lillian turned to face him, but I was too scared to admit it, even to myself. What changed? My father's heart episode. Sitting in that hospital, I realized that if I lost you, if something happened and I never got the chance to tell you how I was starting to feel, I'd regret it for the rest of my life. She pressed her palm against his chest, feeling his heartbeat. Life's too short to waste time being scared. Your father said something similar. My father is a wise man, Lillian smiled. Annoying, but wise. They drove back to the hospital that evening to visit Thomas, who took one look at them walking in together and grinned despite his weakened state. About damn time, he said. Thought I was going to have another heart episode to knock some sense into you two. Don't even joke about that, Lillian scolded, but she was smiling as she leaned down to kiss his forehead. How are you feeling? Like I got kicked by a horse, but alive. Thomas looked between them. You two work things out? We did, Daniel confirmed, his hand finding Lillian's naturally. Good. Because I've been lying here thinking about my funeral, and I'd really prefer not to have my daughter crying alone. Much better if she has a husband who actually loves her standing beside her. Dad, Lillian protested, but Thomas just laughed, a weak, wheezing sound that still held genuine amusement. I'm old, I'm sick, and I almost died last night. I've earned the right to be morbid. He reached out his trembling hand to clasp both of theirs. Take care of each other, build something real together. That's all I want. We will, Lillian promised. We are. Thomas came home from the hospital 3 days later, weaker than before but stable. The doctor was clear about the prognosis. His heart was failing, and it was only a matter of time. But time, they learned, was measured in moments rather than milestones, and they made every moment count. Daniel moved his things into Lillian's room that week, a quiet acknowledgement that they were done with the pretense of separate lives. They fell into new rhythms, waking up together, working the ranch as true partners, spending evenings with Thomas telling stories about the ranch's history and the family that had built it. I want you to have the land, both of you, Thomas said one night while they sat with him. Not just because you're married, but because you'll take care of it the way it deserves. You'll keep it alive. We will, Daniel promised. You have my word. The weeks that followed were bittersweet. Thomas's good days became fewer, his bad days harder. But through it all, Lillian had Daniel beside her, sharing the burden, offering strength when hers failed. And in the quiet moments between crisis and care, they built their marriage into something real. Lillian learned that Daniel sang off-key when he thought no one was listening, that he had a wicked sense of humor hidden beneath his serious exterior, that he cried during sad movies but tried to hide it, that he made love with the same patient intensity he brought to everything else, like he had all the time in the world to learn what made her gasp and sigh. Daniel learned that Lillian talked in her sleep, that she had a stubborn streak a mile wide when it came to things she cared about, that she was ticklish just below her ribs, that when she finally let herself love, she did it with the same fierce determination she brought to everything else, completely, without reservation, with her whole heart. I was so stupid, she told him one morning while they lay tangled together in the pre-dawn darkness. Wasting time being scared when I could have been loving you. You weren't ready. That's not the same as stupid. Daniel kissed her shoulder. We got here eventually. That's what matters. I wish I remembered you from before. I wish I had those memories you have. We're making new memories now. Better ones because we're making them together. He pulled her closer. The past brought us here, but the present is ours to build however we want. Thomas Carter passed away on a Tuesday morning in late autumn, with golden leaves falling outside his window and his daughter holding one hand while his son-in-law held the other. He went peacefully, his last words a whispered, "Take care of each other," that they both promised to honor. The grief was overwhelming, but Lillian didn't face it alone. Daniel was there through every tear, every moment of crushing loss, every time she woke up forgetting her father was gone and then remembered all over again. He held her when she needed to fall apart and gave her space when she needed to be strong. He made funeral arrangements when she couldn't face the details and stood beside her at the service as both husband and partner. "I don't know how I would have survived this without you," she told him the night after the funeral, both of them exhausted and emotionally raw. "You would have survived because you're the strongest person I know. But I'm glad you didn't have to do it alone." Daniel held her close. "We're in this together now. All of it. The good, the bad, the unbearably hard. You and me." "You and me," Lillian echoed, and felt the truth of it settle into her bones. In the months that followed, they learned how to live without Thomas's presence while honoring his memory. They made changes to the ranch, combining Daniel's expertise with Lillian's intimate knowledge of the land. They hired back some of the workers who'd been let go, slowly building the operation into something sustainable and even profitable. But more than that, they learned how to be married. Really married. Not the business arrangement they'd started with, but a partnership built on love and trust, and the kind of deep knowing that came from choosing each other every single day. One evening in early spring, exactly 1 year after Daniel had first appeared on her porch with his impossible proposal, Lillian took him back to the barn where she'd found the letters. The tin box was still there under the loose floorboard, and she pulled it out with reverent hands. "I've been thinking about these," she said, settling beside him on a hay bale. "About the boy who wrote them, and the man you became." "What about them?" Daniel asked carefully. "I think it's time to finish the story." Lillian pulled out a piece of paper, new, not yellowed with age, and a pen. "You wrote me letters for 2 summers telling me how you felt. I think I owe you one in return." She wrote quickly, the words flowing from her heart onto the page. When she finished, she folded it carefully and handed it to Daniel. "Read it," she said softly. Daniel unfolded the letter with trembling hands, his eyes scanning the page. Lillian watched his expression shift from curious to overwhelmed, tears gathering in his eyes as he read. "Dear Daniel, 15 years ago, you watched me by the creek and wrote letters telling me how you felt. You loved me from a distance, patiently and quietly, never asking for anything in return. You spent years building yourself into someone worthy, even though you were always worthy. You came back when I needed you most and saved me without asking for credit. I wish I could go back and tell that girl by the creek to pay attention, to notice the quiet boy working on her father's ranch, to see the depth of feeling in his careful distance. But I can't change the past. What I can do is tell you now, in this moment, with absolute certainty, I love you. Not because you saved me, though you did, not because you're patient and kind and everything I needed, though you are, but because you're you, because you make me laugh, because you see me completely, the good and the bad, and you choose me anyway. Because when I imagine my future, every single version of it has you in it. You've loved me for 15 years. I plan to spend the rest of my life earning that devotion and returning it. You said you'd catch me when I fell. Well, I'm falling. Completely, terrifyingly, wonderfully in love with you. Thank you for waiting. Thank you for coming back. Thank you for showing me what real love looks like. Forever yours, Lillian." Daniel finished reading and looked up at her, his face wet with tears. "Lillian," she kissed him before he could finish, pouring everything she felt into it. When they finally broke apart, both of them were crying and laughing at the same time. "I love you," she said against his lips. "I love you so much it scares me." "Don't be scared." Daniel framed her face in his hands. "We're in this together, always." "Always," she agreed. They put her letter in the tin box alongside his old ones, a completion of the story that had started 15 years ago and was only now reaching its true beginning. Then Daniel took her hand and led her out of the barn into the golden light of spring evening. The ranch stretched out around them, the land they'd saved together, the home they were building. In the distance, the mountains stood purple against the sky, and the creek where a teenage girl had once laughed ran clear and bright. Lillian leaned against Daniel's side, his arms solid around her shoulders, and felt the rightness of it settle deep in her chest. This was where she belonged, not just on this land, but beside this man who'd loved her patiently through the years and distance, who'd saved her not just from financial ruin, but from the loneliness she hadn't even known she was drowning in. "What are you thinking?" Daniel asked, his voice soft. "That my father was right. Life doesn't wait for us to be ready." Lillian turned in his arms to face him fully. But sometimes the wait is worth it. Sometimes the person who shows up offering practical help turns out to be exactly what your heart needed. And sometimes the girl you fall in love with at 19 turns out to be even more remarkable than you remembered. Daniel kissed her forehead gently. "I'd wait another 15 years if I had to. You're worth any amount of patience." "Well, you won't have to. I'm here. I'm yours. For however long we get. Then I'm the luckiest man alive." They stood there as the sun set over their land, two people who'd taken separate paths to get to the same place. A marriage that had started as necessity had transformed into choice. A business arrangement had become a love story. And the man who'd carried feelings silently for 15 years had finally gotten to speak them aloud to the woman who'd learned to return them. It wasn't the fairy tale Lillian had imagined as a girl. It was better. It was real. It was built on honesty and patience and the courage to keep trying even when the outcome was uncertain. And as Daniel took her hand and led her back toward the house where they'd build their life together, Lillian knew with absolute certainty that she'd made the right choice. Not just in saying yes to his proposal all those months ago, but in saying yes to love, in choosing to fall, in trusting that he'd catch her, just like he always had. The lights of the ranch house glowed warm in the gathering darkness, a beacon of home and safety and possibility. And inside those walls, surrounded by the land 3 generations of Carters had loved, Lillian and Daniel would write the next chapter of their story. Together, just as they were always meant to be.